evening. It's nice to hear your lively chatter and talk, and we're grateful that you've come in from the sun to join us for this evening's program. So I'd like to welcome you to, well, I think it's our 34th season. We have some, debate about this. It's, but we've been going for over 30 years, just put it that way. And my name is Gail Jackson. I'm going to be the moderator for this evening. I served as chair for many years of the committee that organizes this speaker series. But Bruce Claflin, who has succeeded me very ably and introduced some new graphics, which I think are terrific, is traveling, so he asked if I would introduce, and I said I was happy to do so. For those of you who are new to the forum, I'll just say that we have been launching these programs, in my opinion, since 1992. They were started, the idea was started by a small group, a private group, that met to talk about significant subjects. And eventually, we started to open it to the public and to find speakers from afar and from the island itself. And it's proved to be a very successful model and one that we hope to continue for many years to come. Tonight, we have in our program speaker a person with extremely desirable attributes. We always have speakers with desirable attributes, and I put the extremely in front this time because he has strong connections to Islesboro, and we always like it when we can pick a person from among our own or close to our own. And his sister has a house on the island here, and he himself has a house in Brooksville, and I think Southport. He's going to move from one to the other. So he's got deep Maine connections, even though he's a very distinguished professor and academician and teacher at Vanderbilt University. I'm going to ask Leslie Glotzel, who was the person who invited our speaker to come, to give us a little more detail on his background and bio, and then he'll be off and away with his program. So stand by, Leslie.
Good evening. Kevin Murphy is a lifelong summer resident of Maine and has worked for the Maine Humanities Council, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and the Brick Store Museum in Kennebunk. He is the Goldberg Chair of Fine Arts at Vanderbilt University and a professor of History of Art and Architecture. With a group of Vanderbilt students, he curated the exhibition Domestic Modernism, the Art of Russell Cheney, which was held at the Ogunquit Museum of American Art in 2024. Kevin is taught at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and at the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. He earned his PhD in art history at Northwestern University. Kevin's talk tonight stems from the research which led to his book, co-authored with Mary Ann Hunting, Women Architects at Work, Making American Modernism, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2025. Kevin's book is for sale tonight through Main Point Books. Thank you to On Miriam. Please join me in welcoming Kevin to the Islesboro Forum.
Thank you very much. I hope to demonstrate my desirable attributes. Okay, there we go. Thank you all for being here. I know it's such a beautiful evening. It's just epic, and being on Islesboro is always so much fun and so exciting. And to be part of this series is really a great honor. And I was actually a little bit intimidated when I read the list of who else was speaking. For one thing, because it includes the president of Wesleyan, who's kind of my personal hero, and actually is one of the few college presidents to whom I've ever written a fan letter, and got an answer. But anyway, so it's a great honor to speak here, and I really appreciate the invitation. So typically, I talk about the content of this book with its co-author, Mary Ann Hunting. So what I'm going to focus on tonight is the part of that research which really stems from things I worked on alone as much as like 20 years ago. And then together we started working on this book about at least 10 years ago. And it was a very, very long research project, and I'll explain as we go along why it was such a complicated undertaking. So as we began to uncover the practices of women architects who were interested in modernism in the U.S. between about the 1920s and 1950s, the period that we really focused on, we kept finding more and more women and learning about them, and we began to think about, well, what connects them as architects? And I think eventually a number of qualities came to the fore with regard to their practices and the buildings they designed. And these qualities, I think, are especially visible in the work of the women architects I want to focus on tonight, who had an impact in Maine particularly. And those qualities are, you see here, adaptability, and that was often a necessity because architecture, as you I'm sure know, was an all-male profession in the 19th century, basically, up to the very end of the century, even into the early 20th century. There were very few educational opportunities for women, very few opportunities to be licensed as architects. So those who were interested in architecture had to adapt and be involved in different aspects of design. We show, I think, in our book that they were quite innovative in a variety of ways, including what we would now characterize as sustainability, which of course was not a term in use in the 30s or 40s or 50s. But some of the women that we looked at were very involved in early explorations of solar power, for example, and solar heating. You'll see examples tonight of buildings that incorporated reused, kind of discarded structures. So reuse was a big part of their practices. Orientation to the landscape, respect for the landscape, all those aspects of what we think of today as sustainability were very much a part of their thinking, as early as the 1930s and 40s. Oftentimes, we found that their architecture their practice was oriented towards buildings that contributed to community. And so in many cases, they were building houses in groups that created, amenable residences for people, in suburbs or in rural areas, kind of arrangements of buildings that would increase interactions between people rather than isolation. And then finally, and this is really important in Maine, their modern architecture typically stressed a connection to local tradition. So even though many of the women that we write about were profoundly influenced by the European modernists like Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, who came to Boston in 1937 and settled at Harvard, Mies van der Rohe, who came to Chicago and settled there, Frank Lloyd Wright, other modernists. Although all of those people were influential, they were also deeply interested in local traditions and in making architecture that didn't reject but rather fit with those traditions, complemented them in certain ways. So why did we undertake this project? Well, one of the reasons was that the work of this kind of pioneering generation of modernist women architects has been generally completely undervalued or not valued, and oftentimes lost. And not lost, a long time ago, but lost very recently. So, for instance, this house in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which was designed by a woman named Frances Baxter Quarton, who is really the only woman in the book who we actually could talk to, because she lived to be, I think, about 100, and she passed away just as kind of we were starting our research, but we did get to talk to her. And she had practice in Lincoln, Mass. With a male partner named Konstantin Pertsov, and together they designed a whole lot of modern houses in Lincoln, and we kind of went to see them, and this was her own house, which personally I think was quite splendid and totally satisfactory for my requirements, but it was purchased by people who wanted something much bigger, much grander, and tore it down and built a really, I hope you're not here, but a very undistinguished McMansion in its place. And we kind of got there just before the bulldozers, and that was not the only case where that happened. So we felt like we were really, capturing this legacy at a moment at which it was under great threat, and it still is under enormous threat. So the core of architects that we looked at were students at this institution. If any of you are from Cambridge, you've probably, or spent time in Cambridge, you've probably walked by it a million times and not noticed it. It's at 53 Church Street, just off of Harvard Square. And it's a, circa, as it says here, circa 1800 house. It was called the Torrey Hancock House. And actually my interest in these architects started by getting interested in the building that was constructed behind this old house in 1928, and this is the building. Great response, right? So like from the street you see this, and then behind it is this. So it's been altered a little bit, but it's owned by Harvard, but it does survive to some degree. So this is 1928. It's really an astonishing thing, and it was built as the drafting room for an all-women's architecture school that was started in 1915. And it went by various names over the course of its lifetime, but generally it was known as the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. Most of the faculty were Harvard professors, and it was started by a man named Bremer Whidden Pond and Henry Frost, those two architects who taught at Harvard, and they were approached by women who wanted to study architecture at Harvard, but of course Harvard was all men at that point. This is 1915, but they said, okay, well you can be students kind of informally in our office. And from that core, it kind of developed into a school in 1928 a woman named Faith Bemis, who had gone to the school and whose father was a very well-known inventor and entrepreneur called Albert Farwell Bemis. And he was very interested in concrete construction. And he had developed this kind of patented method of concrete construction. And so she and he sort of worked together on the design of this drafting wing for the school that was, as I said, built behind the old building. And the school survived until the early 1940s. It was acquired by Smith College in the 1930s for accreditation reasons. And then 1942, World War II, Harvard was losing its male students like, I don't know, 5 a week or something. They had no students, so they had to start allowing women in. And that was the end of the Cambridge School, unfortunately. A cohort of students from the Cambridge School transferred to Harvard and were part of really the first class, first co-ed class that started in 1942. So there you see on the right-hand side, there it is as it exists today. And then on the left-hand side, this really wonderful drawing by one of the students there, Elizabeth Campbell, later Knapp, who was incredibly interesting. She married a Princeton musicologist, and during the winter, during the academic year, she'd be in Princeton being a kind of classic professor's wife, having parties and supporting her husband and all that kind of stuff. And then her father was the kind of inventor of industrial farming in the West. And so she would go to Montana for the summer and run his many thousand-acre ranch. And when he died, she took over that business. So she was this incredible businesswoman, but she did maintain an interest in architecture. And as you see in the middle there, she did these really wonderful drawings that show the relationship of this very modern kind of, factory-like drafting wing and the old house, which they preserved. So that, in ways, a metaphor for what many of these women architects did, which was to adopt aspects of modern architecture and then combine them with traditionalism, and that made a lot of sense in Maine. So among the early graduates was the woman on the right of the Cambridge School, Eleanor Raymond, who had gone to Wellesley College. She then went to the Cambridge School to study architecture. Her sister did as well. She was from a wealthy family in Boston. She became the professional partner of Henry Frost and then had her own practice, which went until the 1970s. So one of the things you'll notice about these women is that they lived incredibly long lives. And so if you need convincing to take up architecture as your profession, as you can see, she lived to be over 100 and was, practicing through the 70s. This is her, I think, about the time she graduated from Wellesley. And so I'm going to focus on her and on the woman on the left, who you may know of, Emily Lansing Muir, who is most prominently associated with Deer Isle, who is both a fine artist and a kind of self-trained architect. Also lived a really long time. I did meet her when she was very, very elderly, and so I got interested in her from that experience. Obviously, she's there as a young woman. So Eleanor Raymond had an uncharacteristic training for a woman of her generation in architecture, in that she went to liberal arts college and then went to architecture school. Emily Muir went to Vassar and dropped out, and studied at the Art Students League in New York, and then was really self-trained in architecture, which is really a more typical path. But they're really the two polarities, and I think there are commonalities between their work, and they both were active in Maine. So at the Cambridge School, where Eleanor Raymond was so important, and she became a kind of mentor of later generations of architects, there was an enormous emphasis on housing as an architectural problem, on collaborative work. That's one of the things that we identified about the women architects of this generation, that they quite often, they were really trained to work as teams rather than as lone geniuses, the way that men often were. So this is an example of a collaborative project that was worked on by a number of the graduates. Suzanne Stockard, who eventually married another architect, who was a member of the Underwood family of the Deviled Ham family, and they moved to South Dartmouth, Mass, and she really became a landscape designer, but she was the first woman to earn an architecture degree, graduate degree at Harvard. Was known as a brilliant student, and this is a collaborative work of her, Jean Allinson, and Marjorie Roberts, the three of them. And you can see that it's 1942. It's a very contemporary perspective on housing complex, and all the buildings were like you see on the left-hand side, with large expanses of glass, kind of simple forms, kind of classically modern elements. So 1942, so that's the key year that Harvard began letting in women. And my collaborator, Marianne Hunting, found this wonderful drawing by this woman, Francisca Hoskin, who was a jewelry designer, an architect, and a very successful photographer, as you see on the right. And this is her cartoon about what was referred to as the invasion of women at Harvard in the fall of 1942. And you see the kind of detail there in the center. There's, it says Robinson Hall, which was where the architecture school was. And, this kind of perception that women were, kind of overtaking Harvard at that point, which was not the case, but that was, in fact, the perception. So, as I said, one of the reasons for undertaking this project was that the danger that the work of these architects was in, and still is in, and that was signaled to me in the early 2000s by the loss of this really epic house in Belmont, Massachusetts, designed by Eleanor Raymond for her sister, Rachel Raymond, in 1931, which is an incredible early example of a modern house, especially in New England, but in the U.S. more generally. And, it's really fascinating because it predates by 6 years the house that Walter Gropius designed in Lincoln, Mass., which some of you may have visited, which is sometimes referred to as the first modern house in Massachusetts, which obviously it wasn't because this was 1931. And Eleanor Raymond and her life partner, who was a woman named Ethel Power, who was the longtime editor of House Beautiful magazine between about the 1920s and 1930s for a period of about 10 years. And she published the work of a lot of European and American modernists. And the two of them, Ethel and Eleanor, made a number of trips to Europe starting in 1928. And they would go and they would look for all of the modern houses they could find in France, Germany, the Netherlands, elsewhere in Europe, Great Britain, and so on, that loved Corbusier's work. And they came back, and this is particularly true of Eleanor Raymond, and I started writing about this a long time ago, got super interested in this house, came back and tried to adapt it for the New England context. So, for example, what appears to be in this image to be this kind of, block of masonry, kind of sugar cube house, in fact, it was clad in rough sawn boards that were stained gray, and the idea was that was meant to blend with the landscape, and you can see that the landscape is left kind of natural. Oops. Uh-oh. Oh, great. Perfect. Phew. So the landscape was left kind of natural, right? So the house wasn't supposed to destroy it, but rather work collaboratively with it. The color of the house is supposed to complement the vegetation, and so on. It was only, it's in Belmont, so it's I don't know, it's like 5 miles from Harvard Square or something. But they wrote about it as our experiment in the country, as though they were out in Nebraska or something. But it was a very hilly, difficult site. You get a little bit of sense of that here. Not an easy place to build, so it was kind of wild. It had that feeling of the countryside. And you can see, there's these kind of metal pipes and, very modern elements, but then at the same time, this real attention to the landscape. I just want to go back for a second. I love this picture because you see that it even has this barn that's like a little modern, block attached to the house. You see the horses sticking their heads out the door, and the lady with her I don't know if it's like a mink stole or something over her arm. Very beautifully dressed, elegant woman. But anyway, they thought of it as a very experimental house, one that brought modern ideas into the context of New England and respected New England, did not try to get beyond it. That was a house for Eleanor's sister. So for herself and Ethel Power, they had a house in Boston, but they also had this really interesting cottage on Cape Ann in Massachusetts on the North Shore. And it was published, as you can see, in the magazine American Home in 1942. And what you see on the left is this little kind of guest house that they cobbled together out of an old garage and a shed or something. And in her article about this experimental house, Ethel Power says, to a coolly appraising eye, the building had no architectural merit whatsoever, unless indeed unassuming simplicity can be so credited. Since we became prejudiced in its favor, we have attempted to classify it as an unsophisticated bit of functionalism. So functionalism would have been an absolute kind of dog whistle for modern architecture in 1933 when she wrote this. But before our judgment was warped, we accepted it for the mere 4 walls and roof that it is. Thus, to bring it into the society of worthy habitations, of which it was to be temporarily a member, we determined to proceed inexpensively by giving it the distinction of conspicuous color. Paint is a great leveler up. I love that. Like as a home renovator, I just think that's a great slogan, right? Paint covers a multitude of sins, I guess. This is one of the images of this little cottage that was published, which I love, and I insisted on my co-author that we use it in the book because I just think the arrangement of these tools and the fact that they would photograph them, just shows this kind of commitment to everyday objects and to simplicity and functionalism, these ideas that are core to modernism, but they're bringing it into the context of a very kind of familiar domestic architecture. There again is the cottage on the left. You see where they've used this very bright color, these bright blues to contrast with the white. And I think they're thinking of, the Mediterranean houses that they'd seen in, the south of France or in Spain or Greece, etc. So to get to Maine. So you see, so this is 1933, and elsewhere in this article she says, we had the idea of doing a bigger house, and then the Depression came along, and we had to make do with what we had. So there's this kind of adaptability that I talked about earlier. You see that also in this cottage from the 1930s, which I visited so many decades ago, and remains one of my favorite houses of all time. And that's saying a lot because I've obsessed on a lot of houses. So it was, if anybody knows Biddeford Pool, it's a little, enclave at the mouth of the Saco River in Biddeford, where there had been cottages, big shingle-style cottages like Islesboro, constructed from the end of the 19th century. 1930s, Eleanor Raymond was commissioned by the Stackpole family to build a cottage. And again, 30s, Depression, she wants to make do. So incorporated into this cottage are actually a number of little outbuildings that existed on the property. And she very beautifully and skillfully connected them to create this kind of expansive house that spreads across this site that's on the edge of the ocean. And so the way that it sits, it faces north towards Prouts Neck and Portland. So if you're building a summer house, it's facing north. That's not great, right? That's not that desirable. So notice what she does. She inserts this row of kind of what I would call monitor windows on the south side to catch the light for the living room, which is going to be facing due north towards the water, which I think is amazingly clever. And she creates this sort of U on the sunny side of the house so that you can enjoy that prospect. So here's the ocean side. You could see, it's very close to the edge of the water, and you get a sense of how she's, cobbled together these little, very ordinary buildings. But she, uses, for example, windows at the corners to give, kind of modern expression to this, what is a very modest cottage, but I think really, really interesting. This led to a number of other commissions in Biddeford Pool. This is another one. This was the basis of this cottage was in a Coast Guard life-saving station or boathouse, which is that center portion of the building. And then she kind of added on to it. It's been altered quite a bit. As you can see, this is from a very recent or fairly recent advertisement on VRBO or something. It's from 1942. There you see it has a pretty decent spot there on the beach. in Biddeford Pool, and just a couple of views of the interior. I mean, there's not, it's been, as I said, pretty extensively altered, but I don't think it was ever, extremely fancy or elaborate. It was just a beach house, but it shows her feeling for these kind of simple New England structures and how they can be repurposed. So I want to turn now to Emily Muir, who's, as I mentioned earlier, had a very different trajectory. She, as I said, had gone to Vassar, and she got thrown out when she turned up at graduation in men's clothes or something, and it was not for her. And so she went to study art in New York, and then married a sculptor named Bill Muir in 1928. She is known largely, I think, as a painter. You may have seen her work in galleries in Maine, but also at the Farnsworth Museum, where they had a big retrospective a couple of years ago. I think this painting, this is a characteristic painting for her. Much of her painting took place in and around Stonington, where they lived. She was very interested in, the famous Stonington Deer Isle granite, which you see looming in the foreground of the painting, and she did many paintings of the islands. Typical themes, right, from Maine painters of that time or any other time, but using kind of abstract means, abstracting those natural forms, lobster boats and so on, all very familiar, in really interesting ways. So she also is known locally, and I got interested in her from because a mentor of mine, the late Sandra Armentrout, and her husband had commissioned Emily to design a cottage for them at Crockett Cove in the late 1960s. So what we've written not only in the book about this project, but also in a follow-up article about women as real estate developers. A woman rarely, if ever, designed alone all of the houses in a particular development. An exception to this generalization was possible when a woman acted as both developer and architect, another rarity. One example is that of Emily Stewart Lansing Muir, who created a development and designed the houses for it down in Down East Maine. With post-war highway construction, as you know, second homes became increasingly common along the seacoast, even in such remote locations as Deer Isle, Maine, where the village of Stonington had once prospered through fishing and granite quarrying, particularly in the 19th century. After a bridge was constructed, the famous Deer Isle Bridge, in 1939, Deer Isle attracted more visitors, especially visual artists like Lansing Muir, a painter. Though lacking formal architectural education, as I said, she embarked on a small-scale practice that included a house and studio for her sculptor husband, William, and herself. Eventually, she designed some 46 houses, which is quite a lot, in Deer Isle, 13 of which were part of a development she laid out around Crockett Cove on a wooded parcel of land she purchased in 1959. Explaining her intentions, Lansing Muir said that the houses, quote, turned out contemporary, but they're not copies of anything I ever saw. They're meant to fit the needs of the landscape. Because they were frequently situated in wooded settings, as opposed to open fields where the original farmhouses stood, she adopted a specific tactic of putting what she called the drama on the Penobscot Bay side. Thus, soaring walls of glass faced the water, while wood siding and other friendly materials flanked the less prominent sides, complementing the modest vernacular dwellings she admired. More than just acting as an architect, however, Muir functioned too as a developer. Her capital, like that of many other women developers, undoubtedly came from her family, since both her parents had died a few years before she embarked on this Crockett Cove project. Her father, a man named Van Rensselaer Lansing, sounds like a pretty impressive name, an engineer who wrote and spoke widely on the use of lighting in commercial and residential spaces, was successful enough to purchase a cooperative apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan in 1943. At about the same time, he acquired extensive property in Stonington. So, and that is a core property that where she would build these houses. And what she did was to subdivide the property and then to preserve a core of it as what's now known as the Crockett Cove Woods, which is a nature conservancy property which you can go visit. And so the idea was that the houses were modern, but they fit in with the landscape through their materials and by not intruding too much on the landscape. And there is a view on the Crockett Cove there on the left-hand side in Stonington on the southern end of Deer Isle. This is a speculative house. This is an early one, 1960. You can see it's right over that rock that she loved to paint in Stonington. A couple of other examples. So the idea was that if you bought a lot there, she reserved the right to design the house. So there was a kind of consistency among the buildings. And there you see a view of one of the interiors. And they typically have a lot of the stone from Deer Isle, from the actual site in many cases, wood, and then expanses of glass, very much a modern notion of connecting interior and exterior, which many modern architects were committed to. There, another view, many of them are, or some of them at least are still in the same families that built them, and they're very, cherished and well preserved. So Muir, she had a big impact on Deer Isle, doing almost 50 houses. She was not nationally known, but she had, I would suggest, a kind of national impact because she was responsible for bringing the Haystack School, which was not on Deer Isle, to this property on Deer Isle, where Edward Lowry B. Barnes would design this very famous complex, which many of you probably have visited, in 1960, which is noteworthy for its incorporation of vernacularly inspired forms, its integration with the landscape, etc., all characteristics of Emily Muir's work at about the same time. And as I said, she wasn't the designer, but she did have a role in bringing Haystack to Deer Isle. I want to finally just mention, our book does not go this far forward in time, but I just want to mention the work of a couple of women architects and firms that I think continues some of the themes that we observed in the modern architecture of the interwar and immediate post-war period. For example, Barbet Wheelock, which you may know in Portland, this is the design of their own house, which I find quite interesting for the way that it combines the forms of a 19th century kind of Gothic, Carpenter Gothic cottage with these much more modern expression that's particularly visible at the first story in the horizontal boards and that kind of grid of elements there at the front, and especially on the side and the back where it really, the house really opens up. Or this house, which has, this is very recent, which has attracted a lot of attention by the architect Jesse Carroll, the Spectre House on Great Diamond Island, which has won at least one design award. And looking at some of this recent work, I think that there's the echo of what we observed in an earlier period of profound respect for integration with the landscape, use of very simplified modern forms, but oftentimes materials that complement the sites, deep respect for the landscape of Maine. So, there are many more figures who could be talked about, I think, in this history, but what I've wanted to do is emphasize some themes in the work of women architects, particularly in Maine, that I think are really enduring influences on the very special kind of modern architecture that has been built here over the last century or so. Thank you. I should have said at the beginning that would have been happy to have you interrupt me or object or ask questions or whatever, but at this point I'd also be happy to answer any that may have arisen. Yes?
You spoke about the original house in Cambridge, and then the backside of it there was that modernistic structure or drawing. What was the motivation, first motivation of the architect to go to something boxy, open, so different than the typical Cape Cod structure?
Well, that's really interesting. So there was a little bit of an internal struggle over the design. And, at one point, Henry Frost, who is the director of the school, writes to somebody who says, the moderns, which is how he characterized, that group of architects and students at the school who are interested in modernism, are kind of, having their way with regard to this addition. So it wasn't as though they everybody immediately embraced modernism, but there was a certain faction. And the patron and one of the designers, Faith Bemis Meme, is interesting because her father was this kind of inventor, and she had worked with them and designed some concrete houses that he then built, and there were some in Wellesley and other suburbs of Boston. And so she was very interested in this kind of experimental aspect of architecture, so that was part of it. But she also, she married this guy named John Gaw Meme, who was an architect in the Southwest. And she eventually moves there, marries him, and she writes a letter to her classmates at some point from the Southwest. I think they were in Albuquerque, and she says, the vernacular architecture here is really interesting, the kind of Pueblo style. And there's much in it, I I'm paraphrasing, to interest the moderns. So she perceived that there was this connection between kind of simple traditional architecture and modern architecture. And that's really what gets, that point of view gets articulated in that building where those two elements come together. And so I think that she was really interested in that idea. And as the patron, and as the person doing a lot of the designing, I think she was able to prevail. And she was working with Eleanor Raymond, who was more senior at that point and licensed. And Raymond, in the 1930s, was doing two things: designing very, very modern houses, and she published a book on early Pennsylvania farmhouses and barns. So she too was somebody who's interested in finding the connections between traditional and modern architecture. So, and I think that the building really represents that interest that at least some of them were committed to. Sure. Yes, in the back there.
It's one thing to design buildings like this, but how did they get anyone local to build them?
You mean the actual builders? So they, often it was a struggle to find somebody, A, who wanted to work with a woman architect, and B, who was amenable to their ideas. So there was a lot of, kind of casting about for the right person. And I think that once they developed relationships, they kept using the same builders and craftspeople. And like today, anybody who's built something, that you almost inevitably end up having arguments with the builder, and there's evidence in the archives of them having those sorts of struggles. Yes. What? Like Corbusier's? Yes. Well, it's challenging for sure. I mean, sometimes the walls rise above the roof and mask the fact that there's actually a slope there. But unlike many other modern architects, we never were told, oh, this was a disaster functionally, or I always think of this famous quote from Le Corbusier's client for the Villa Savoie, which you may know from around 1930 in Poissy, France. And the client, this woman, writes to Corbusier, and she says, you have all the time in the world to bring your students to come see my house, but it's raining in the hall and it's raining in the bathroom, and you never do anything about it. And that's definitely not the mentality of women architects. They didn't feel, one of the things that we thought and wrote about quite a bit was the fact that they did not feel like they could be great artists and do whatever they wanted, and if you didn't like it, tough. They didn't feel like they could behave that way professionally. They felt like they really had to make functional buildings. Yes, they were very committed to certain aesthetic ideas, but they were also very committed to making things that worked for them and for their clients. Yes?
So that Eleanor Raymond house from 1931 being so far ahead of the Gropius house feels like a big deal. Has that been well received by the academic community, and do you think that it will stick and change the canon?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's become much more canonical. I think it was torn down in, I want to say, 2003 or something like that. And at that point, there were many people in my field who wrote about how this is such an important building, how can you possibly tear it down? And that just really didn't get any traction whatsoever. But I think, now it's very much thought of as canonical, and I think that there's a much rethinking of the kind of chronology even of modern buildings, modern houses as a result of that. Yes.
Yeah, I guess just to follow on from that, are any of the houses you discussed, maybe particularly on Deer Isle, are they listed on the National Historic Register, or are any of them protected?
Well, I don't know if they're on the National Register. They're certainly not in a local historic district. The listing on the National Register doesn't really protect a house. And, I've just been reading today about the proposed weakening of preservation protections for government buildings. So, no, there's, unless they're in local historic districts or they're individually nominated to local historic districts to have, very, vigorous, guidelines and review criteria and so on, there's very little that can be done. I mean, even in Lincoln, right, where there's a huge, Lincoln, Mass, there's a huge sensibility about modern architecture, and there was a lot of debate about that house I started with. It still was torn down. There's nothing that could be done about it. Yes.
What's the status of women architects today as a percentage of all architects sort of on the East Coast and also in the country as a whole?
Wow. I'm not really qualified to say that, but I will say that the proportion of women as licensed architects has risen enormously. The number of women in architecture schools is at least 50%, if not more, but there is still a glass ceiling. And, in terms of, receiving recognition, many women have commented on this. That's, still there's these kind of famous cases of sexism and all kinds, harassment and so on. So there are many more women in architecture. There still are barriers to women practicing architecture, I think.
I'm afraid we're going to need to bring it to a close in order to be faithful to our time zone. But we have books, and I'm sure that Professor Murphy will be happy to answer questions.
Yes.
Kevin. Answer questions if you'd like to pose them to him while he's still here. I'm going to come up and make a couple of remarks. What do you think this is? Some people might call it a chamber pot. Some might call it a lobster pot. This is where we put contributions for the forum. We do have expenses in the form of our technical production, the setup of the room, the rental of the room, some travel expenses. So we'd be grateful for any contributions that you feel comfortable making. Now, I'll put down this. I had to do this because our treasurer, Peter Rothschild, would have fired me if I hadn't. So, a quick word about next week. But first, I do want to thank Kevin. Where did you go? There you are. Yes. For bringing forward these wonderfully innovative women whose lights were probably held under a bushel for many years, if not their entire careers. And you do a real service to make us aware of this. I loved the description of the things you found in common: innovation, adaptability, community, sustainability. I probably have forgotten a couple, but they really resonated. So thank you for bringing Now, next week, we have another speaker with extremely desirable attributes, and that is Peter Latman, whom many of you know. He is what we call here, for Kevin who might not know, he's an outlaw because he's not an in-law. We call those who have married into a family that is, let's say, multi-generational outlaws. So Peter is one of those, but he's brought a tremendous fund of talent and experience to the island. His formal title is Managing Director for Media at the Emerson Collective, and some of you may know that that is a philanthropic organization that is run by Laureen Powell Jobs, Steve Jobs' widow. And among other things, they have acquired a number of publications, including The Atlantic magazine, which has absolutely been killing it in the complimentary vernacular with the stories that they have produced in recent months and years. And Peter, I think, has had a lot to do with that. He is vice chair of The Atlantic. He was a reporter at the New York Times and an editor there, and he was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. So he'll be with us as our speaker next week, and I look forward to seeing all of you. Pass the word. Now, one more thing. A couple of people have said to me, shoot, I forgot about the forum last week or the week before. This simply shouldn't happen. We're doing our best to publicize and get the word out. If you check the calendar of the community center, it will always list what our program is. And there are flyers in windows of the Dark Harbor shop and the grocery store and other places. So please don't forget, these are programs that are truly gems to have, and you should be here in person to experience them. Thank you and good night.